Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sandra Collins and I'm the Director of the National Library of Ireland. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first in a new series of talks for friends of libraries across the globe. We want to think about the role of libraries and the relationships that people share with these special institutions. We'll be inviting friends of the National Library to reflect on the place libraries have in their lives. And I think if you too are someone that loves libraries, then you're really going to enjoy this conversation. We'll be recording this webinar and you're most welcome to join the conversation by asking a question using the Q&A function, and we'll pick those up later in the evening. So let me begin by introducing our two wonderful speakers tonight. Dr. Joe Hasid is a graduate of Harvard Law School and holds a PhD in Anglo-Irish Literature from University College Dublin. He's a leading trial lawyer in Washington, and he has written extensively on Yeats, Joyce, and other Irish writers. His books include W.B. Yeats and the Muses, The Ulysses Trial, Beauty and Truth Meet the Law, and Yeats Now, Echoing into Life, which was published just last year by Lilliput Press. Joe is also a patron of the arts, and with his support, we established the National Library's annual Yeats Lecture, which has been running each year since 2014. Professor Margaret Kelleher is Chair of Anglo-Irish Literature and Drama at University College Dublin. Her publications on Irish literature and culture include The Cambridge History of Irish Literature and the Mam Trasna Murders. She is chair of the Irish Film Institute and former chairperson of the International Association for the Study of Irish Literatures. And she was the UCD creative and academic lead on the Museum of Literature Ireland, our great friend Molly. And Molly is a partnership between University College Dublin and the National Library. So Joe, Margaret, let's get started. Something we always say about the National Library is that the collections are the heart of the library. What do collections, objects, archives mean to you?
Well, thank you very much, Sandra. What a pleasure it is to be with you and Margaret, even though it has to be virtual for the moment anyway. Well, one of the things I love about libraries generally, and I certainly love about the National Library of Ireland, is that it's a place where you find what Henry James called the visitable past. It's a great kind of resonant phrase, and he defined it as a place, and I'm going to read so I get the real Jamesian cadence. He said that in the visitable past, you find the fragrance of the poetry of the thing outlived and gone, and yet in which the precious element of closeness, telling so much of connections, but tasting so much of differences, remains appreciable. That's a real Jamesian mouthful, but what he's saying is that the visible past, and he says this elsewhere, is as though you were sitting at one end of a long table and you could just see the other end is the visible past. And you therefore had both the closeness and the distance. And I do think that the visitable past is a way of getting closer to great writers and the work of great writers. James wrote about this concept in the preface to his short novel, The Aspirin Papers, which involves a scholar in a, one might say, obsessive quest for the papers of a dead poet. And so I've had the same, so I've had an obsessive quest for papers and drafts and so on relating to the poetry of W.B. Yeats. And one of the images I love, and maybe you could show it, Catherine, is in the National Library is a letter from Yeats to Olivia Shakespeare, who was his first lover. And although he went off on his quest of Maud Gonne, they remained friends for the remainder of their lives. And a long way after they had parted, they met again, and Yeats wrote a great poem called After Long Silence. And you could see the poem in its bursting forth in this letter from Yeats to Olivia Shakespeare, in which he tells how, begins with a great opening speech after long silence, it is right. And then he tells about how they could descant and yet descant and yet again descant upon the supreme theme of art and song. Bodily decrepitude is wisdom. Young, we loved each other and were ignorant. Long period. And one can really feel it. It's really something to touch these letters and smell them and feel them in their context. And I think it does bring you closer to both the poem and to the poet. It's a character in Sally Rooney's novel, Conversation with Friends, who says, nobody who loves Yeats, who likes Yeats, could be capable of human intimacy. But I think that that kind of is the cartoon character of Yeats that a lot of us are saddled with. But I think the author of this letter does know something about human intimacy. And the letter itself is wonderful to have and to touch and to even smell, and to kind of bring that back. Another thing that is in the library, which is really hugely valuable, are the manuscripts of the drafts of that poem. And you can see in them where he changes from saying that decrepitude increases wisdom, and he makes a stroke through it, and it becomes bodily decrepitude is wisdom. I mean, that's kind of where you see the poem coming into being. The American poet Susan Howe talks about how when you see these changes being made, she says the words are on the outside, but inside where that change is happening, she says, comes from a deeper place where music before counting hails from. Interesting way of putting it. And one last thought on this subject is in the beautiful National Library exhibit, Listen Now Again, about the poetry of Seamus and the life of Seamus Heaney. It has a wonderful interactive feature where you can actually see the change being made on a screen, which is, and that in a way is where the poetry is happening. And it's really interesting to see. So that's one of my favorite things about libraries, research libraries, and certainly the National Library and the Heaney exhibit are really premier examples of that. Now, Margaret, I know, made a trip back to the visitable past, and she found some interesting things, and she brought it forward in an interesting book.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I was just, as you were talking there, I was just thinking how powerful that concept is of the visitable past, and also then the obstacles to visiting that. And for me, I suppose one of the objects I would mention is something I found along the way on the work for the Mam Trasna Murders book. You know, for quite a period of time, I felt very stuck by the obstacles of revisiting the past. And one of the obstacles was, in a way, how to get past some of the traditional source material. So sometimes traditional sources can really, in a way, get in the way, because so much of what I was coming across were official reports, reports by unsympathetic journalists and so forth. And, you know, one of my truisms, I kept reading the remote area of Mam Trasna, and one of my kind of epiphanies was, well, an area is never remote to the people who live there. And so for me, one of the challenges in the book was how could I, in a way, turn the lens or change the perspective? And I really had a sort of eureka moment if we could see this next image, which is a photograph, and it's a photograph of Miles Joyce. It's held here in the National Library as part of the Invincibles album, and congratulations, Sandra, to you and colleagues who've digitized this whole album. So it's readily available even at home when we're all working from home on our laptops. And I still find it a really moving image. You know, Miles Joyce, we now know, was in his early 40s, and some of the early accounts, including indeed by James Joyce, he's represented as being a much older figure. And in many ways, there's a sort of serenity, isn't there, about the photograph? There's a kind of almost a peacefulness about him, because he was a man who was innocent and knew himself to be innocent. And this photo would have been taken, and soon after the men were brought to Kilmainham. It wasn't found for many years. In fact, it resurfaced thanks to the wonderful work by Sean O'Kieran and others who've worked so hard on the Mam Trasna case. And Sean himself has written an excellent book, Oscuelga, about the case. And it now appears that the photos were taken by a former British Army officer who's a prison warder, and who took the photographs and kept them in a photo album. And there are lots of others, for example, of the Invincibles associated with the Phoenix Park murders, also of 1882. So it's an amazing resource. And as I say, it kind of helped me, Joe, to come back to the quotation you used. It helped me, I think, to visit the past and to try to imagine, you know, the case that was the Mam Trasna murders from the point of view of a man who was innocent and believed, alas wrongly, that he'd receive a fair trial. And the second object I chose for this evening was published in 1884. And it's by Tim Harrington, who at the time was a young journalist, I think a very brave journalist, who really risked his own political future in terms of an aspiring parliamentarian as well, to publish this pamphlet about the Mam Trasna massacre. And again, the National Library holds it as part of the excellent Harrington papers, which are both the papers actually of Tim Harrington and then also of his son, Niall Harrington. But it's astonishing if you see there the list of names. I mean, again, Joe, to your legal sense, I mean, I'm not sure it would be possible in the day in which we live to have squarely publishing in 1884 the following: a list of names arrested for the murder, the actual murderers. One could even see, I think, probably the influence of the publisher, those small caps, now alleged, very small caps, independent witnesses and others. And in fact, Harrington's findings hold up very well. Jarlath Waldron, who published the first, main book on the Mam Trasna murders, really showed that Harrington was right on those whom he deemed to be guilty. But it seems to me amazing that this is published in 1884, and yet the posthumous pardon, for Miles Joyce would take well over a century to happen. And I suppose the phrase I would put with what you said there, Joe, is that I think these objects remind us that the present is only one of the possibilities of the past. And it's through these objects we can, in a way, reclaim or revisit, some of the other possibilities.
Yeah, totally interesting. And one of the interesting things about your book, Margaret, was how powerful it was about penetrating through all that morass of the past. But the launch of it taking place in the Green Street courthouse where the trial took place was really, that was a trip to the visitable past of a really powerful nature. So your whole journey there, Margaret, is really inspiring, and it is a great testament to what libraries can bring to us by letting us visit the past, and then that enables us to bring the past into the present.
Had you another choice, Joe, of an object that's powerful for you?
Very quickly, I wonder if Kathy put up very quickly the quite interesting, this so-called Clement Shorter version of Yeats's poem, Easter 1916. Yeats wrote the poem in the summer of 1916, but he didn't publish it generally until 1920. And there were a number of reasons he didn't. But one of them, I'm sure, was his ambivalence about the rising. His ambivalence, in the poem itself, he says, was it needless death after all? And his ambivalence about whether he might have been a partial cause of it through the play he and Lady Gregory wrote, Kathleen the Houlihan. But this particular piece of the visitable past is interesting to me because it's a kind of an embodiment of Yeats's hesitation. To steal a line from him, the uncertainty of it setting forth. This kind of embodies the uncertainty of that iconic poem, Easter 1916, setting forth. So it's a great thing to be able to go to a library and see this as a way of kind of concretizing, making material that amorphous emotional quality. I'm happy to say you could see this at Maui.
Yes, thanks to you, Joe. Absolutely. Thank you.
Something there about the visible past and place. So that we can, the importance of the place, the physical impact of the space as well. I mean, it's something I always feel every time I walk into the main reading room in the National Library is the presence, maybe of all the ghosts in the room. Does the physical space make a difference?
So hugely, I think, and it's funny, just very recently, in the context actually of my current book project, which I'm pleased to say is a joint biography of Mary and Pádraig Colum. I'm still at the very early stages of that work, but only very recently I was looking at a book written by Pádraig and Mary called Our Friend James Joyce. In fact, my own copy comes remaindered from a library, I think, as many of us who gather books have from the Fremont Newark Library Junior College District. But early on in the biography of Joyce, Pádraig Colum is recalling seeing Joyce in the reading room. Again, I think it might be of interest to some of the younger members this evening that the reading room at the time he's describing was open until 10 p.m. in the evening, Sandra, I think. And according to Pádraig Colum, James Joyce would, quote, enter the rotunda of the reading room at the library generally between 8 and 9 o'clock in the evening. But Colum goes on to give, I think it's very beautiful, just short a paragraph, if you don't mind, I might read it, just describing himself as a young person who actually wasn't a college student, was an independent scholar, and what the National Library meant for him. And it's just about 5 sentences. Young people have no aptitude for evaluating what is theirs by inheritance. They step into it. That is all they know about it. So it was with the students and the casual intellectuals among the youth of Dublin. In the reading room of the National Library, they had a handsome place in which to read, to view each other, to converse in the portico below, to make the encounters that permitted couples to walk together to their quarters. The library thus provided something of a social life as well as an intellectual life. It was hospitable. It's a beautiful adjective for the National Library. It was hospitable. And the other passage, just mentioned very briefly, I just came across 2 weeks ago with the MA group in Irish Literature in UCD. We were reading the wonderful Mary Lavin from her collection In the Middle of the Fields. And one of the stories, The Lucky Pair, in that collection describes from the point of view of the central character, Vera, describes her disappointment when the man she's expecting to arrive in the reading room hasn't arrived. And I just read this short passage for all of us who sit in the rotunda and our minds, what would you say, hover away from the objects in front of us. She sat down and tried to concentrate. It was a fine evening, and on the dome overhead, still daylit and blue, a few pigeons paraded. They could be very distracting because although through the frosted glass their bodies were blurred, their pink feet formed patterns exact and clear-cut. After a few minutes, one of them caught up a lump of dislodged masonry with his pink toes and clinked it against the glass. Lifting it, he let it drop again and then repeated the performance, and it was soon apparent that this noise would be kept up as long as there was light in the sky. 1 or 2 people tittered, 1 or 2 frowned. So when we get back to the wonderful reading room, let's all look up at the masonry. What about you, Joe? The significance of places for you?
Well, thank you, Margaret. You know, it's interesting. I think of a great scene in Ulysses in episode 9, the so-called Scylla and Charybdis of Ulysses, where I suppose Joyce maybe wasn't so much having a great social moment of the kind that you just referred to, but he did have a gathering around him there in the director's office, in which he, well, his doppelganger, Stephen Dedalus, lectures on his theory about Hamlet in the office of the director of the library, and the others from the staff are gathered around, and they're having a chat about it. And it's a fascinating, to me, kind of fixing in time. For as long as people read Ulysses, which will be a long time, I think, there's that image of the National Library of Ireland is a place where people come together and have a friendly conversation about important ideas and about books and about culture. And it's a wonderful function of a library like the National Library. And it's so cheering to me that in a sense, the return, and maybe Catherine, you might show the beautiful copy number 1 of Ulysses, has found its way back to the Mali, which is, as Sandra mentioned, is a joint undertaking of University College Dublin and the National Library. So Ulysses, of course, is modeled in its way on the Odyssey, and so it's a journey where Ulysses is trying to achieve, to use the fancy Greek word, a nastos, a return to home. And so he's wandering around. Ulysses wanders through the world. Leopold Bloom kind of wanders through Dublin. And it's really fascinating to me that thanks to the generosity and farsightedness of Harriet Shaw Weaver, who was a patron of Joyce's and to whom Joyce gave the first copy. And she, through her generosity, she gave the first copy to University College Dublin. And it's now on display in the Mali Museum. And to me, it reenacts the journey of Odysseus, the journey of Leopold Bloom and Stephen through Ulysses, and in a way, the journey of all of us that can lead us to a beautiful place like the National Library. And in Mali, you can also get a very fine meal and a fine cafe latte and even a glass of wine. And coming soon, be out in the garden when we have social life. So both places and the Heaney exhibit at the Bank of Ireland, all of these aspects of the National Library are kind of modeled in the scene in Ulysses where people come together and have a conversation in the library. And it's a great kind of thing that kind of event is immortalized in the novel Ulysses.
I mean, her giving of that to the National Library, Harriet Shaw Weaver, it must be in Irish cultural history one of the greatest acts of patronage, really, isn't it? It's quite astonishing, Sandra. I'm sure it's, you know, something of it must be a kind of a key moment in the National Library's history.
Exactly. So, and I mean, we've talked about the importance of the object and being in the presence of the object. I think having, you know, a moment to be in the presence of that book and all that it means and the history it carries with it. And then for copy number 1 to make the journey from the National Library, well, from Joyce to Harriet to the National Library, and then to make that journey across Stephen's Green to go on display in Mali. I just, something really beautiful about that, and to have that chance to share that with so many visitors to Mali and so many lovers of literature. It's really special. And is journey something, I mean, we've talked about the objects, the place, the journey of the object connected with the place. Is journey something, you know, a journey for yourself as scholars, and how does that connect with your experience of libraries, your relationships with collections and archives?
Well, mine is a long journey. It actually starts back in 1980 when I was a student of the great Gus Martin's. Margaret and I often kid that she is in what Gus called the apostolic line of succession as the professor of Anglo-Irish literature. And when I was Gus's student, I was interested in trying to decipher Yeats's self-composed epitaph, "Cast a cold eye on life, on death, horsemen pass by." And I got interested in the fact that because that's kind of an off-putting notion initially, the cold eye on life. And I got interested in the Yeats poem, "The Fisherman," in which he says, "Someday perhaps I shall write him a poem as cold and passionate as the dawn." And that fusion of cold and passion was interesting to me as a possible way of ameliorating the seeming harshness of the epitaph. And then Yeats says in his essay, a general introduction for my work, that he copied the phrase from a letter of his father's. So I spent many an hour going through the dreaded microfiche in the National Library in the year 1980 and 81, trying to find that letter. I'm still looking, but there's a letter that's very close to it, which Roy Foster identified as the letter, because it's timed just before Yeats wrote the poem, "The Fisherman." And John Bell Yeats's letter refers to the liberating splendor of the sun, of the cold and the sunrise. I'm sure it is the passage, but it shows you two things. One, the pleasure of searching for something in the library, and two, you see the great poet at work. It's much as we did in looking at the poem After Long Silence. You see the poet compressing things. That's kind of an awful lot of what poetry is compressing experience and language into a form that kind of leaps off the page. So that to me was my introduction to the library, and I'm happy to say the journey is still going, and one of the great pleasures of the journey, might just take a minute. I wonder if, Catherine, you might show the beautiful Yeats's butterfly ring that the library kindly gave me a beautiful image of to use in my recent book about, quote, Yeats Now, Echoing into Life. Part of what echoes into life from Yeats is the wisdom of a couple of lines from his poem, Tom O'Roughly, in which he says, "For wisdom is a butterfly and not a gloomy bird of prey." And George Yeats, just before she married W.B. Yeats, asked their friend Edmund Dulac to design a ring for Yeats. And he designed it with this butterfly. It was on his side there, I think. He designed the ring with this butterfly on it. And Yeats wrote him a letter saying that I'll always be able to explain what my ring means because I've written a poem about it. So part of my journey was the library so kindly giving me this beautiful photograph to use in my book, which is for me a part of a continuing journey.
And could I reiterate just the beauty of Joe's book, both as an artifact so beautifully published by Lilliput Press recently, but also as a kind of book of our time. I don't think you could ever have realized, Joe, how much we need the kind of reflections, on friendship, for example, is one of the things that comes to mind so movingly in your book. So it has been in its own way a prophetic book, and I warmly recommend it to anyone who hasn't had a chance to encounter it. I suppose for me, the journey too, we've talked about the place, but it's so much about the people. One story I was thinking of, when Mam Traston was published, I managed to have a dual celebration, the wonderful location of Green Street, as Joe mentioned. And then we also had a reception in the front hall of the National Library. And for me, there was a sense of bringing the book. But one of the stories I was recalling that evening was when I was a graduate student many decades ago, and just the welcome from the people at security. You know, it can be an intimidating place, the National Library, for the first entry, like any formal building. And, you know, for many of us for whom education was a kind of a recent arrival, third level education was a recent arrival in our family history. You know, I can remember as a graduate student going in with a bit of trepidation, and the hospitality, to go back to Pádraig Colum's word, was from the get-go, from actually the people at security. And then I was saying over the years, you know, when I got busy with other things and I would go in and someone would say, "We haven't seen you for a while, Margaret." It was like the voice of my conscience bringing me back to the reading room. So I do think for me it's a really important occasion tonight to salute the people of the National Library in all of the sectors, kind of throughout the institution, and just how important that is. And of course, in recent years, we've mentioned Molly this evening, and that has been genuine joy. My sibling on the project has been Catherine McSharry, and Catherine and Sandra are the two NLI board members of Molly, and that has been a genuinely enriching collaboration, and one from which I continue to learn a great deal myself. So I suppose for me, we have talked about places, but it is very much, as indeed my friendship with Joe would testify, it is also about people.
Exactly.
Just to second that, Sandra, you and Margaret and everybody, you and Catherine and Margaret, because Margaret's in a way part of the National Library because of Molly. These friendships are really imperishable and so important. And I want to lay claim too to a launch in the rotunda there of my Ulysses related book. And it's a fantastic place for a launch. And I might tell this slight tale out of school is that Roy Foster said to me, "Oh, that's a great place for a launch." He said, "You can't be cornered there." Anyway,
there are no corners.
It's part of a continuing and wonderful journey to be in this beautiful place and its adjuncts, and to work with these wonderful people, and so selfless and dedicated, and contribute so much to the life of Ireland and the world.
That is so lovely to hear, and I really feel that as well. Like there's so much, you know, so many relationships, just a lot of love in the building itself. Like seeing our researchers, our visitors coming through the door, like it's just the beating heart of the library, and the relationships over time. Like I love the stories of friendship and chatting at the portico, and just the life of the library, I suppose. And then I remember book launches, Margaret, your own, so recently, there was such a, you know, there was a huge crowd. I'll be worrying about our health and safety limits and so on, but the feeling of love in the room and just absolute, you know, it's all those relationships, really important and really life affirming. And I think it breathes life into the library. Like I often think, exactly as you say, our buildings are so central to, I mean, to so much literature, central to the experience of our scholars, our readers, our researchers, our visitors, everybody that comes through the doors. But they can be, if that's not your background, they definitely can take a pause to walk through that door. So those relationships and the welcome for everybody coming through that door is really, really important, and a really long tradition in the library, something I think to be proud of.
And I was just thinking there, and I suspect it's something that many people, you know, attending this evening can identify with, that narcissistic moment when you first check the catalogue to find your own name. That sense of bringing the book back to the library, or having an entry in the library. It's very thrilling.
Exactly, that's the perfect journey, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you think something I love to see in the collections are those friendships, those love affairs, that those relationships captured in the collections. And I mean, diaries, letters, do you think there's something special about that personal voice and the relationship between writers? You know, you're going into one archive and then you see these amazing relationships that mean so much, that lead you into other writers.
Yeah. It's funny you should say that, Sandra. It's something I've been thinking about a lot, particularly in the context of women's writing, that I think we're really only beginning to understand the importance of networks and connections. And I mean, they're clearly important for male writers as well. And we've mentioned Yeats and Joyce and Heaney. But I think there's a way in which, for a lot of maybe women's writings that aren't as well known, that there's a way in which, through looking at networks, we can begin to reclaim them. I think it's one of the power actually of digital scholarship, that it's helping us to do social network analysis and to kind of draw connections between people. And I think that will be increasingly important for libraries in the future. And I do think it will be a way of maybe building inclusivity as well, you know, because sometimes there is a danger maybe that our histories can be about single figures. And as Joe's bringing out in the discussion of Yeats, you know, and indeed Roy Foster's biographies brought out so fully, you know, the lived life is always about networks and connections and influences, but how to do justice to that, I think, will be an interesting challenge in times ahead, and maybe for libraries to find ways of reflecting that scholarship that's about groups, maybe rather than just individuals. But that's just off the top of my head, Sandra.
Yeah, I think that's it's something really important to think about, because what we collect is the record, and those choices you make and the connections you make, and I suppose the prominence that the collections have. Will absolutely, there'll be gendered aspects to that, and questions about diverse communities and new voices and how we collect that. I think it's so important. It's something Sinead Gleeson said to me, is that so in celebrating the women authors, women writers, that the collections are there, they exist in the library, and the women authors might have been very celebrated at the time and then fade into a kind of obscurity that I think is a part of our social commentary. It's something for us to ask ourselves how that happens again and again, and then you can come back to that, so you can address it again, as long as you have those authentic objects, as long as you have the collections to come back to, and our interpretation and our analysis changes over the decades as well. So just so important, I think, to build the collections and keep them and let people interpret and understand, and let that change over time. Yeah.
Totally. If I could just add a footnote to that, the preservation and then the making accessible the military history records was a major thing. And Roy Foster's book, Vivid Faces, is so interesting because it was a group biography of a whole generation that led to 1916. And through those records and through his other diligent research, much of it at the National Library, he brought out the role of women in that whole movement, including teaching and theatrical productions, and it really expanded the concept of what led to 1916. And going forward, one of the incidental consequences of the pandemic is, I think, the acceleration of a process that might have happened anyway. And that is that the fruits of research and collection and preservation of the visitable past can be sent out into the ether through virtual connections. And I do think it will increase inclusivity in the culture as a whole, provided everybody has a laptop. And that's part of, that's part of what society has to be focusing on.
Yeah.
However, I still want everybody to come back to the library or to Monterey and have a coffee or a drink.
Exactly. We'll have, exactly, Joe. We want both. That really wide reach and that democratization, I think, that the online and digitization and online events can give us, but then something so special about the physical experience as well.
I'm ready for it.
Yes.
Can I ask you a question? We've a few questions in on the chat and people are very welcome to send them in. It's so lovely to hear people responding to Joe and Margaret. I have a question here from a very long time reader at the library, Paul, and he says it's going to touch on this idea of the physical experience in digitization. So he says, my most intimate moment in the library was handling the Lawrence glass plate photos when he was investigating his local history. And so that really careful, like literally very careful touching of the past. And I think then he has a kind of lament that because they're digitized now, you would go first to the digital resource, you know, preserving and keeping safe the physical, and the digital provides access. But it's a kind of a lament for that intimate and unique experience. So what do you think is that balance between the digital and physical, and what made a difference to both of you in your research, your scholarship?
Margaret, do you want to start with that? Because
Sure.
you actually found that.
Yes. Yeah. I think it is a key dilemma that I think Paul is highlighting there, because when I was a graduate student, and we're talking about the late 80s now, and particularly when I was doing my PhD in Boston College, I remember visiting the library to work actually on the Yeats papers for an assignment as part of my PhD work, and I was able to see the originals. But I can remember even as a young person being half appalled that I could see the originals. You know, I knew they were really precious, and obviously now one couldn't. You know, one's looking at, for a while it would have been obviously the microfiches. People will remember the microfiches in the manuscript room, and now obviously the digitized version. And there is a loss in that, certainly, but it is also crucial about preservation. As I say, even as a graduate student, there was a little part of me torn between being excited and thinking, I'm not sure this is right. So I think it is a balance. And I suppose that's why, and again, we would applaud the National Library on this, the importance of exhibitions. And I suppose, you know, it's been part of the excitement about the Mali collaboration, at the risk of putting words in the National Library's mouth, that it has extended the exhibition space, you know, so greatly for you in terms of the treasures that you can show, and of course the exciting plans you have yourselves for the work you're doing on the building. But I think it is crucial that people do get to see the objects, you know, even if they can't handle them or touch them. It's so important that people have that sense of things, and that's why, for example, in Mali, one of the juxtapositions I love, and I notice visitors noticing this, is on the one hand the magnificent, you know, copy number 1, and people stand with tears in their eyes, but also the pamphlet that Joyce, you know, co-published with Francis Skeffington at the time, later Sheehy Skeffington, The Day of the Rabblement, you know, which he self-published in a kind of fit of pique, when the university magazine wouldn't publish him. But I think I love to say to my own students, Joyce's first publication was a self-publication. You know, it's such a 21st century concept. And I think that journey then that Mali is able to show, thanks to the manuscripts from the National Library and from Desmond Green and other acquisitions, and also very proud to feature holdings from UCD special collections in Mali, that those objects then can show people the journey. So I think digitization is just necessary, but it should always be accompanied by a chance for people in a democratic way, to come back to what both of you said, Joe and Sandra, to actually visit the object. So it kind of behoves us to do both, I think. Would you agree, Joe?
Totally. Yeah, couldn't have said it better. Yep.
Yeah.
So I suppose, like you're in America, so you can visit the library through the online catalogue. I mean, I suppose it is brilliant for reach and where people can't, come directly to the source. There's something really useful about that, even if you don't have the full mystery of the smell of the object we talked about earlier.
It can be a start of the journey. You could then, if travel is possible and you have the time and can afford it, then you can go and actually see and touch. And you may be stimulated to do it and want to make the sacrifice to be able to do it by getting introduced to it virtually.
Yeah, exactly. I have a lovely comment from Moya Cannon, who says it's really drawing out the idea that you have about hospitality and the hospitality of libraries. And she says as well, the hospitality for the introverted. So I really love that idea. It is a space of where quiet has a really special value, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's funny. The first Broadway play I ever saw was A Music Man. It has a great song about Marion the librarian. I did one. Hello, Moya. I'm a great fan of Moya's, as I know Margaret is. But I'm trying to think what Harold Hill says. But when I try in here to catch your ear, he can't get the lovely Marion the librarian because the world accepts his unforgivable sin, and he talking out loud to any librarian such as Marion. So, Moya, you're in good company with Professor Harold Hill. No talking out loud in the library, but you can always go out into the rotunda and have a chat if you're so moved. Yeah, but the library is a wonderfully, I love that passage Margaret wrote, because it is a way of coming together around something other than the pure or the unadorned idea of coming together. And as Moya says, it's also a place to go to be quiet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that over the decades and men and women together, I love that idea of the romances born in the library as well. Love to gather those stories too.
Great virtual experiences. The launch of Moya's collected poems, presided over by Margaret, was a great virtual experience and a real milestone in Irish writing.
Here, and allowed us to bring people from Spain, all parts of Ireland, the United States, Brazil together. So I do wonder how things will change in the future. I love your point, Joe, about that the journey can be from the virtual back to the material. That's a really good point. We think of it so often as the material to the virtual and as loss. But I love the way you've kind of inverted it, that the virtual and the electronic and the digital can actually bring us back to the material and the physical. That's very reassuring.
I was playing in my mind the other day with way back when I was an undergraduate in beautiful Buffalo, New York at Canisius College. We read Teilhard de Chardin with the idea of the he had the idea of a noosphere, which he kind of piled on top of the idea of the biosphere. And the noosphere is kind of a thinking membrane encircling the world. And he thought, and it was kind of in connection with that, he coined the phrase, everything that rises must converge, which found its way into the title of a short story by Flannery O'Connor. But there is the notion, which may actually be happening in some odd way via the internet and via what we're doing right now, is that the difference, the distinction between the real and the virtual is getting smaller and smaller. So maybe someday we'll actually be having a virtual embrace via electronic means, but I hope it doesn't displace the in-person. But it is interesting, the difference between the physical and the intellectual or the spiritual and the material is decreasing. But maybe that's only the fevered idea of a mind that's longing to be there in person and touch all of you.
But I like the idea too that it can be both and rather than either or. And it's reminded me of a detail from cultural history that always kind of amuses me, that, for example, when Charlotte Brooke published her Relics of Irish Poetry, and there was a fear, you know, that the printed book would kind of mean the end of the manuscript tradition. And then for a number of decades, various manuscript scribes dutifully copied from Charlotte Brooke's book back into the manuscript tradition. You know, and it's a nice example that some of those cultural trends can be in both directions and don't have to be as relentlessly unidirectional as maybe we might fear. So there's, yeah, really, that's one I'll take away with me, Joe. Thank you.
I have a really a thought-provoking comment from Theo Dorgan. He's saying he's sorry we won't stay talking all night, but we will finish on time. But he's reflecting on how the National Library is a guarantor of liberty and freedom of thought by preserving our memory as it actually is, by offering that dispassionate corrective to partial, partisan and arbitrary versions of the truth. Like, it's something that's so important now, like more than ever, you think.
Yeah.
Totally. Go ahead, you, Margaret. Go ahead. I couldn't say it better than Theo. Margaret, why don't you
No, and I'm just thinking of Theo's own poetry for that, actually, of that kind of frightening image of what can be lost. Yeah, no, I think the words speak for themselves. Just here's to guaranteeing liberty and freedom of thought and preserving our memory as it actually is. I suppose the only word I'd add to that is the word in all its messiness. You know, it's a word I use a bit in the Mam Trastner book. I was delighted to discover in sociolinguistics it's an accepted term for the kind of messiness of actual language use. That, for example, in bilingualism, people are very rarely perfect, so to speak, in two languages, but can move in and out of languages, and that there's a messiness in actual language use. And maybe that's something for us to think about, that preserving our memories, it actually is, can be in its messiness. And I suppose by that I mean things that don't fit. And I do want to salute the National Library and your collections policy on that, Sandra. I think, you know, in recent years, what you have chosen to preserve has actually sometimes been quite surprising, and in a really good way. So here's to that.
I think that's right, because at the moment where you are collecting something, where you're making those decisions, you can't see the future narrative of that. So it's that, you know, it's our ephemera, our domestic collections, like the capturing of the full life experience. It's not a single object. It's that broadness, and the messy objects and the unconnected objects and the objects that you don't understand now will be really important in the future. Yeah. And ordinary life, I guess, as well. Gosh, there's so many questions and so many good questions. It's hard to pick. I've an observation about a museum in the Netherlands. So we talked about that wonderful smell in libraries, which sometimes is the smell of the books decaying. So let's just focus on the good bits. Where a museum in the Netherlands has a digital exhibition, and they send you a box of scents at home so that you can have the online experience and immerse yourself in the full scented experience. Geraldine Higgins has reminded me, we talked about Moya's the sense of hospitality of a library, and she's reminded me of Moya's poem The Genius of the Place, which the first time I heard that, I just thought that such a, we've talked about like how important it is, those relationships and the welcome from everybody in the library. So from the first person you meet at the security desk, and as Moya observed in that poem, from our cleaners polishing the stairs, it's the whole thing, isn't it? And that's why the people in the reading rooms, the people coming in the doors, are so important as well. It's like full circle of life to write the book. I think that's right as well. There's a lot history there to coming from Kildare Street, the intimacy of
Your connection, Sandra, is wavering a little bit, just to let you know.
I'm glad you said that. I thought maybe it was my mind was.
So suppose it's getting late now.
No, you're back.
So many of the comments and people's observations are about the intimacy, I suppose, the experience of the object in the place as part of your own personal journey, and just how intimate and important that is. It's coming through really strong. And Desmond Greenbury, it exists and what is there, and even imagining what it might be like to visit or revisit, and planning to do so enriches the spirit.
Yeah.
Gosh, I think I'm close to tears hearing that. It's something to you both. So after all these reflections on how the library is a part of people's lives, a part of their journey, it feels somehow like a friend to us. What would be your wish now, as we're coming out of COVID, I hope? What's your wish for your friend, the National Library, in the future? So do you want to jump in?
I'll jump in, then Margaret will give a more comprehensive and intelligent conclusion.
It's another minute.
I'm thinking actually of the narrator, whose name I think people have decided is Marcel in the Proust's great novel. He's always going to go to Paris, and he's always going to go to London, and he's always thinking about what it's going to be like in London. And it turns out in a way that his experience of London is his imagination of going there. And in a way, so at the moment, we're saddled with just having the anticipation of the journey. But that in itself, and witness today's experience for me anyway, has been a great pleasure to see all of you and to be also feeling the out there in the noosphere, Moya and Theo, and I know Paula must be nearby. I think that it's wonderful to have this much and this anticipation that the day will come when we'll be back together physically. And the library and Mali will be a great magnet drawing people back together. And all the virtual experience will be great and will continue, but I think that the library will continue to draw people. That's my hope for it, is it will do both. It will reach out, it will be more inclusive, there'll be more women writers able to get their work out through their own efforts, being self-publishers like Joyce, and being brought to the attention of other publishers who will be more and more dominated by women. So there'll be more inclusiveness all around, but we'll all get back to, really it is the heart of much of Irish cultural life is in the National Library, and we're all longing to get back there.
Thanks, Joan. Margaret, any good wishes?
Yeah, tempted to say what Joe said. And I mean that. I mean, it's wonderful this evening, and thank you so much to have the opportunity and indeed to be seeing and so to speak, but particularly hearing from friends, and lovely to hear Desmond's words. I do love that, knowing that it exists and what is there. And Desmond himself in a great lineage of book collectors and supporters, from Harriet Shaw Weaver, Desmond, Joe Hasid and others. I think the only thing I'd add is looking to the future, and I suppose thinking back again on that line of Pádraig Colum, talking about how important and hospitable the library was for him as a young man. And I think the phrase I was just checking there, he talks about young people stepping into something. And I suppose my hope is that young people will step into the National Library, obviously through the different activities and the digital, but will also step in physically. So I suppose the teacher in me is always looking to the next generation. So may it be that the next generation, and gosh, with all they've gone through in the last while, step into the National Library and keep it alive, Sandra. So.
Exactly, Margaret, all those relationships, all those long journeys, we have to catch them early. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Okay, so Joe, Margaret, I'm just going to say thank you so much, and to our really lively and loving audience. It felt like a big hug hearing all those comments, and hugs are short to come by these days. I would say on behalf of the library, I think our greatest wish is to welcome you back. It's just not the same library without our wonderful visitors through the doors. So in the meantime, I hope in the coming weeks, coming months at the latest, that we will be welcoming people back through our doors and getting lots of those intimate encounters with the collections back going again. And in the meantime, just to encourage everybody to drop into the website if you can't drop into the building. We've moved so much online, and explore, enjoy, and come back for conversations like this until the day we open the doors again soon. So thank you so much, Joe and Margaret. That was really lovely. It really was a love letter to libraries. I'm feeling very emotional now.
Pleasure. Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Good night.